if I like it.
How are you? Sit down. I don't think it mentioned. Is that okay?
Professor, you don't know the magic to make the room a little bit cooler.
We have called the facility, but there's another room that was not cool. Well, I think we'll leave the door open.
Yeah, it sounds to be a good idea.
Okay, so I'm a little concerned about that and people getting around and not. Do you mind if we just put you where you were by Roger here? If we put them by our.
We would have obstructed it, but how about this right here?
I'm just a little concerned because yeah. Thanks. I'm going to guard the camera here. I'm standing here to. No, go ahead there. Why don't you see a couple seats over there? I'm just trying to so people can come in and not on camera. Hang on, let's see if we've got people in. So it is going to, since we do want to stay in a room once we get in, even though the door's going to stay, we've got some seats. We've got a whole front row of seats. I think so. I think we're good. But yeah, we are going to have to close the door somewhat for the sound. We have lots of front row seats.
Hi everybody, welcome to the second round of our presentations. I am Marissa, this is Marissa, and this is Matthew. What are the presentations? First up, here's Marissa. Hello everyone. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Marissa DeLaurentis. Today I'm going to be presenting you my research and a little bit of narrative of how I came to this idea of how to create a safe learning environment during independent reading in a third grade classroom. So I'm just going to provide a bit of an outline of what I'm going to cover in my presentation today. So I'm going to first provide you with the context of my placement, so give you a little bit of insight into where I was student teaching this past year. Then I'll identify the dilemma that I observed while I was in my placement, which led me to conduct this research. Following that, I'll identify the research question that I created, the processes that I took in conducting that research, which included a resource review, collecting some data, and then analyzing that data. And I'll conclude with some of my own personal reflections and takeaways of this research process. So I student taught at Cambridgeport Elementary School. I was in a third grade classroom and I had 22 students. I had 12 girls and 10 boys. Of those 22 students, I had one English language learner, which means that their first language was not English. And then I had 7 students who were on individualized education plans. So now I'm going to take you back to January when this process began for me. So I took over the nonfiction reading unit, and this was the first unit that I had taken over. So just to give you a little bit of insight into what a typical reading block looks like, it's normally about 50 to 60 minutes. The first 10 to 20 minutes are normally a mini lesson where I'm teaching my students a specific skill or strategy that I want them to learn, and then it's followed by an independent reading block, which is anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes. And now, while I was taking over this unit, I was observing this particular dilemma. I was observing that my students were lacking focus, and that my students didn't seem engaged. And the reason that I put engaged in quotes is because how I might perceive my students to be engaged may be different than how someone else perceives them to be engaged. And so what I was experiencing is a lot like what's going on here. So students were having sad conversations. It didn't even really look like students were reading. They weren't even looking at their books. I noticed that I had to give a lot of individual and whole group reminders, as did my mentor teacher when she was in the room. And so what you might ask is, okay, why is this a dilemma? Because these kids look like they're having a great time. And so as an elementary school teacher, it's really important that students are independently reading every single day. I've done a lot of research throughout this program in my 4 years at Brandeis about the importance of exposing students to literature at such young ages. It's really correlated to students growing as learners. And so I wanted to find a way to help this dilemma that I was noticing and experiencing. However, I kept coming back to this question. And that was, is it fair of me to expect my students to read for 30 to 40 minutes at a time? I know as an adult it can be hard to sit and read for long periods of time, so I kept questioning, is it fair of me to set these high expectations on my students? And this led me to my research question: how can I create an environment for students to meet the expectations during independent reading times? So this question is very specific to me as their teacher and what I could do to help them meet these high expectations that I set in place for them. And so from here, I began to conduct my resource review. So I started reading up on some literature to inform me more on this topic of independent reading and to see what other educators are doing that are experiencing similar dilemmas. And so one of the common themes in a lot of what I was reading is this importance of not only establishing expectations early on in the year, but then making sure to take the time to reinforce those expectations. And so I not only wanted to remind my students of what I was expecting of them, but also myself, so I knew what I was expecting of them. So I asked myself, what were the expectations that my mentor and teacher and I established at the beginning of the year? And I came down to two that we strongly enforced from the beginning of the year, and those were that students are reading for the entire chunk of independent reading, so the 30 to 40 minutes that they're actually reading during that time, and also that they're completing any activity or assignments given to them. So these are the two expectations that I started to reinforce in my classroom. We even had a community meeting where we talked about them, and so I really wanted to make them explicit to my students so that they knew what I was expecting of them. And so from here, I wanted to determine exactly how many of my students felt they were meeting these expectations. And so I created a student self-assessment, which looks like this. And so I was asking students to reflect on 3 questions. Did I do my best work today after independent reading? Did I try my hardest? And did I complete the activity that was given to me and or read for the entire chunk of independent reading? And I did want them to reflect on all 3 of these questions, but I was specifically looking at this 3rd question, which was directly related to my expectations of them, to see how many of them felt they were meeting these expectations. And so I collected what I call pre-intervention data. And so I wanted to determine how many students were responding yes to that 3rd survey question after independent reading. So I distributed this self-assessment for a full week after independent reading. I collected them anonymously, and I just calculated the average number of students that were responding yes to that 3rd survey question. And I found that prior to any intervention, an average of 54% of students said that they were meeting the expectations during independent reading. Now, while this was more than half of my class saying that they were meeting the expectations, I wanted to see if there was anything that I could do to increase the number of students that were meeting those expectations. So from here, I determined different strategies that I would want to implement into the classroom over the course of 2 weeks. Now, some of you may be familiar with the takeover weeks. Those were kind of a very taxing time on us interns, but it was 2 weeks where we got to take over the classroom and sort of act as the head teacher. And so I specifically wanted to implement strategies during independent reading during those 2 weeks. So the 3 strategies I came to were 1, playing background music while students are reading. This particular group of educators that I got this idea from was looking at the impact of playing pop versus classical music in a classroom and the impact that had on student achievement. And overall just found that playing music in general had a really positive trend in how students were succeeding in the classroom. Then playing background music as well as a scenic video while students are reading, and engaging students in coloring a mandala for 10 minutes prior to reading. And this particular strategy is what we would call mindfulness activity. And for those of you who don't know, mindfulness activities are activities that are intended to make students more present in the moment, and they're sort of intended to calm down students, especially in such a chaotic day. And so this particular group of educators was looking at the impact that mindfulness had on students' anxiety levels before taking tests, and they also found them to be effective. So I decided on these 3 interventions since they were effective for other educators. And so now I just want to give you some examples of what these looked like in my classroom. So over the course of 2 weeks, I implemented these 3 interventions, and each day I would implement a different one. So some days I would have this background music playing while students are independently reading. Other days I would have the video projected on the board as well as the scenic music playing. And then other days I would have students engage in coloring a mandala for 10 minutes prior to the independent reading. So from here, some of my initial discoveries. So we took some field notes in a teaching journal throughout the course of our research, and so some of my initial discoveries that I had jotted down in that journal were that students just seemed way more engaged. So there was a lot more positive behaviors during the independent reading time. I noticed less students were having side conversations, less students were asking to use the bathroom, and also students were just very excited about the interventions. They looked forward to coloring and looked forward to the mandalas, and they started to notice the positive impact they had on them. One student even mentioned, I really like how the music helped with noise control, which I thought was awesome coming from one of my 3rd grade students. So they were noticing the impact that these interventions were having on them. And so I overall was noticing a really positive impact of my intervention. However, I did want to continue to collect data to really see the impact it was having on my students meeting those expectations. And so I continued to distribute that self-assessment over the course of the 2 weeks that I was doing my takeover. And so I collected the data and I put it into an Excel spreadsheet so that I could later compare the number of students that were meeting those expectations before intervention to during the intervention. And what I did was I transformed that data into a visual graph to more easily see the impact that my interventions were having on the students. And so this was the graph that I created, and it's showing the students that were meeting those independent reading expectations both before the intervention and during the intervention. And so the yellow line is representing that baseline data that I took. So that's the 54% of students before the intervention that were saying, yes, I'm meeting the expectations. And then the 2 chunks of bar graphs represents the 2 weeks where I was implementing my intervention. And then the 3 different colors represent the 3 different interventions. And as you can see, those initial discoveries that I was making are reflected in this graph, as the average number of students were saying that they were meeting those expectations did increase while I was implementing my strategies. And so from here, I wanted to determine which of the 3 strategies was most impacting how my students were assessing or causing the most number of students to say they were meeting those expectations. And so I calculated the average for each intervention, and I found that when I played the music with no video, an average of 72% of students said that they were meeting those expectations. When I would play the music with the video, an average of 63% of students said that they were meeting those expectations. And then when I had them color the mandala, an average of 68% of students said they were meeting those expectations. So while these all are bigger than that 54% that was saying they were meeting those expectations pre-intervention, as you can see, playing the music with no video had the greatest impact on how students were meeting those expectations. And so now I'm going to take you back to that original question that I had asked myself, and that is it fair of me to expect my students to read for 30 to 40 minutes at a time? And what I can now say is, yes, it is fair of me to be expecting my students. However, as their teacher, it's important that I'm doing 2 things, and that's that I'm making sure my students are aware of what I'm expecting of them, and that I'm creating a safe learning environment. And so these are my 2 biggest takeaways, because I feel like this applies to any student, no matter how old. I feel like as students, we excel in environments where we feel supported and we feel safe, and also where we know what's expected of us. And so with that, I just want to leave you with this final quote that I feel like not only encompasses my research, but all the research presentations that you'll see today. And it says, if a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way they learn. And I feel like this goes hand in hand with teacher research and this idea that we constantly need to be adjusting our practice to be meeting the needs of our learners. And so with that, thank you. If anybody has any questions?
Okay, can you go back to the graph for a second?
Yes.
So, sorry, on the graph, that was the student response of the reflection. How would you perceive, like, do you think that's accurate, or what would you say?
Yeah, so I feel like I wanted to make the student responses anonymous so they felt like they could more honestly respond to that survey. However, there were some students that did put their names on them, and it was those students that were putting their names on them that were more positively self-assessing. Also, and so also, when I would distribute that self-assessment, I would notice that some students would take it very seriously. Like, some students seemed like very anxious to like fill out this self-assessment. Other students would just fill it out and give it to me. So yeah, it's definitely, it may be different than sort of what I was perceiving, but overall, I do feel like there definitely was a positive trend in their behaviors. But yeah, how accurate the data is.
Which do you think was the best? Like, which had the most positive effect from your eyes?
I think honestly the music with no video, just because I feel like playing the scenic video, and we had a conversation about this before I implemented it, was a little bit distracting for some kiddos. And we talked about if you're going to be distracted by the visual, like turn your backs to the visual. But I mean some students didn't, so I definitely saw the music with no video. Also because the mandala, I feel like almost calmed them down too much as to where they were like putting their heads down. So I definitely agree with what is shown here.
In the first, the one that was the 72%, had you determined what varied the type of music and the volume of the sound as to whether that would fluctuate at 72%?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I kept it completely consistent. I played the same music. The visual, while up here it stayed consistent, it does sort of change, but the music stayed steady throughout the entire time.
What was it?
The one I played up here for you guys.
Oh.
It's like the piano music.
Oh, okay.
I'm curious if you had a chance to ask students, and if you didn't ask them what you think they might have said, if you asked them, like, why do you think it's hard? Or how did it feel when we changed it?
Yeah, so I had originally planned that I was going to go back to my placement and collect some like post-intervention data, but I ended up in a new placement for the rest of my practice, so I wasn't able to ask them that. But yeah, I had a really honest and open group of students, so I feel like they would have been open to saying, you know, yeah, the video distracted me, or some students felt that the mandala was boring. So I even got a little bit of that feedback, just that I like took note of in my inquiry journal. Thank you. Now my partner and crying, the other one's literally. I have a quick setup. All right. Okay.
Hello, I am Marissa, and my research is on timely transitions, minimizing transition times to maximize productivity. About my placement, I was in a third grade classroom at Bishop Elementary School in Arlington, Massachusetts. I had 25 students, 11 boys, 14 girls. Out of those children, 4 were on IEPs, and I had 2 English language learners. These are them over there. As you can tell from the picture, they are very high energy group of kids. Most of them have been together since kindergarten, so they have formed really close relationships with each other. That's a great thing, but as a teacher, that can provide some classroom management issues. So classic teacher saying, lack of time. I kept finding that I was planning my lessons and I was accounting for all the time, but somehow I just wasn't having enough time. They didn't have those extra minutes to finish their work. I didn't have those extra few minutes to wrap up a lesson. And I started to look at the classroom, just make observations, and I started to notice that these transitions were taking so long. They would go from the rug to the desks. They wouldn't follow directions right away. They would be chatting with their friends. They would get distracted by whatever. And then I also noticed behavior problems during these transitions. Students were loud. Arguments happened the most during these times, which led to my teacher research question, which is what teaching strategies can help minimize transition times and in turn maximize productive classroom time. Sorry. And just background, transitions are a time in school when students are moving as a group to a different environment, subject, or even just an activity. So That's the transition from home to school. It's also from English to math. It's from the rug for a lesson to their seats. And going into this, I knew that I wasn't going to somehow find an extra hour in every day. But even if I could just find an extra 5 minutes to finish up a lesson over the course of 180 days, that can add up to the equivalent of 2.5 school days, which would be very helpful as a teacher. My data sources that I used were a resource review where I kind of looked at other classrooms, talked to other teachers, and find out what works in other classrooms and then what has been researched. I used an inquiry journal where I reflected on my ideas and thinking. I had an inquiry community where I got feedback from them. I collected qualitative data from field notes, so I wrote down any observations for these transitions. And then my quantitative data was the times pre and post implementation of my strategies. So this is the primary strategy that I chose to implement. I picked this strategy because knowing my students, which is very important as an elementary school teacher, I knew that they were very competitive. A lot of them played sports, so I knew that some type of game would be very motivational for them. So this is our game, and it's over here as well. Using pre-implementation data, I created expected transition times for each type of transition. And then I collected the time for every transition throughout the school day, and I would write it up here. At the end of the day, we would all call back together, and this is something the students really looked forward to. We would pick a transition randomly, and if the transition that we had was less than the expected time, they earned a letter toward their target word, which is perseverance, which aligned with our integrated ELA and social studies curriculum. As well as this strategy, this was kind of my main motivational strategy, but I also used supplemental strategies to kind of help them during those specific transitions. These are the 3 that I used the most. Music, just calming music as I walked into the classroom for that home to school transition. The visual timer, so they were aware of their time and how much they had left to get under the expected time. And then bouncingballs.org is a fun one. This is a picture when it uses your computer and the microphone in your computer. So that's when it's quiet in the classroom, and then this is when it's really noisy. So and it would shush them out loud as well. So during those transitions, students would be tiptoeing around the classroom, trying not to make the computer shush down, which was very fun. So this is some of my data after I implemented these strategies. Now, I could look closely at each one of these transitions, but as you can see from my graph, the morning and the end of day transition take the most time. So those are the 2 where I felt I could gain the most time back from. So I really looked at those the most. And I compared both the times and my observations pre and post implementation. So this is very busy looking, I'm sorry. This is what I first did to kind of look for trends in the data. The green is if they met the expected time or were below it, and the red is if they did not. I was happy to notice right off the bat that the greens increased and the reds decreased throughout my data. And then the top is just my pre-implementation. But I really kind of wanted to look more closely and see exactly how much time I was saving. So this was the morning transition prior to intervention, prior to me implementing the strategies. This took anywhere between 8 and 22 minutes. This is when students enter the classroom, they take off their backpacks, put it away, and then they get started on their morning work. It should not take 22 minutes. I would walk up to students, I'd be like, my friend, the bell rang 12 minutes ago and you still have your backpack on, what's happening? So since I knew they could get 8 minutes, that was my expected time for them. After implementing, this is still my 8-minute mark. And it took them some adjusting, but towards the end, they were consistently staying around that 8-minute. And it decreased to as little as 6.5 minutes. And the strategy that I found most useful, which might be another reason it took them more time in the beginning, because I was kind of trying out different strategies to see what helped the most. Similar to Marissa's instrumental music when they come in the classroom. It's just very calming, it really helps them keep the chatter down and walk in and get what they needed to get done. And then the visual timers, they were aware of how much time they were taking. So there was a 15.5-minute range with this data, which I thought was incredible. And the overall time went down. My observations showed increased or improved student behavior, so less distractions, quieter transitions, no more, or not as many arguments. There's always going to be little things. Same thing for the end of day transition. I called this the most hectic time of the day because the kids want to get out of there, the teachers want to get out of there. So this transition took 20 minutes to about 9 minutes. So I knew that they could get under 10 minutes, which is what I made the expected time. And then this transition decreased to as little as 7 minutes. I found that the bouncyball.org strategy helped the most with this because they're putting up their chairs. It can just be chaotic in this room at this time. So the bouncyball.org, it helped them just be aware of their volume. And then again, the visual timer. So overall, there was a 13-minute range with this data. So it did continue to decrease overall, and they were right around their expected time. Same thing with this, student behavior improved and quieter transitions. So my biggest takeaway, or one of my biggest takeaway, this is the one I was really looking for going into this research. So potentially 15 minutes a day extra, saving that time in the morning transition, and 10 minutes of saved time at the end of the day is potentially an extra 25 minutes a day of productive learning time. It wouldn't be every day because there were variations in the data, but this is on a good day. But more than that, I realized that when students are working towards a common goal to spell this word and to get there, it was a end of day, like free time is what they chose as their reward. They really worked hard to hold themselves accountable and also their classmates. So students practice social emotional strategies like teamwork, avoiding distractions, helping others, and there was just an overall sense of increased community and teamwork throughout the classroom, which was very, very nice to see. Moving forward, I'm really curious if these strategies will be effective in my next third grade classroom. So we'll see about that. And that's it, thank you.
Yeah, did it seem like, because I know, you're getting to around that target time towards the end of your data collection, did it seem like those behaviors were going to continue? If you did it seem like it was a consistent, they were downtrending and then they would sort of hit that and be able to maintain that?
For the time or the student years?
Behaviors.
They were consistently staying around it. Like every transition is different. It depends if there's a cleanup. It depends what they're going to next, if they're looking forward to it or not. So there's a lot of different factors that play into how badly they want to meet the expected time. But they definitely were staying around it just because the more transitions they have underneath the time here, the more likely they are to get their reward at the end. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm curious, it seems, well, I was thinking about individual students as you were presenting this, and it seems like you kind of focused on the class as a whole, which makes sense, but when you presented the initial data of, say, the student taking 22 minutes, that's probably not the whole class, probably a lot of it. So I guess I'm curious, did you track individual students, or did you find that you were tailoring strategies for specific individuals?
Yeah, so a lot of what I did, which I wasn't able to put into my research, was kind of, this was a challenge as well, was meeting diverse needs to help the students reach the time. So I just had this one kiddo who was just slow, and that's okay. He just was at a different pace than the rest of the class. So one thing I did, which proved very helpful for this particular student, was I said, okay, we're going to make a transition in 2 minutes. You're going to make it right now first, and then you're going to hold the timer for the rest of the class. So that he kind of felt like he was still part of the transition, but still wasn't holding back the classroom. Great question.
Good morning. My name is Matthew Chernick, and my research presentation is entitled Framing and Reframing Film and Media for Effective Classroom Instruction. So before we begin, I think we need to have a little background about me and why this topic is so important to myself and my teaching practice. So I have a previous master's in what's called comparative humanities, and I have an undergraduate education in film studies. And for both of these degrees, I wrote really extended academic research papers on film studies topics, usually dealing with the early and silent cinema. For those of you, that's the black and white movies with no sound. Everyone finds incredibly boring. So, and all of the first project involved a film called The Crowd and its connection to European opera. And the second paper in my master's degree focused on French street criminals called the Posh and their connection to the early cinema. Now, both of these papers looked at film as aesthetic documents and as cultural products. And I'm moving from a place where film is looked at as, an artistic element into a place where it's used to support student learning. And in a lot of ways, there are some teachers who don't really find film to be an effective and engaging way to work in the classroom. It's low engagement. It doesn't always provide a lot of interactive potential. So with this in mind, I came up with my research question, which is, how can I utilize more film and video in my classroom and integrate it in a way that improves student learning and engagement as well as my teaching practice? And I did this through the idea of both scaffolding and content. Content is what students are learning, the facts, the details, the dates, the ideas. And